Evening, everybody. I'm Sean Johnson, and like Matt and John, and I don't know who else, there was another young gentleman here who are beekeepers. I'm going to do a little presentation on some of the things I find interesting about beekeeping, as well as just some things about nature itself. And beekeeping is a very, very deep subject. And you always keep finding more things to learn when you start studying bees. So, like I said, I kind of did this presentation based on some of the stuff that I find really interesting about beekeeping. It may not be as interesting to everybody else, but I hope to at least try to make it a little interesting. So, like I said, I've been doing beekeeping since 2003. So coming up close to 15 years, not quite there yet. I actually took my first class here in Spencer, Iowa at the, what do you call it, the Iowa State Extension Office. So, and since then I've just done a lot of studying on bees, ecology, biodiversity, those types of things. So, one of the things that I find really interesting is how important bees are and all the different things that link people to bees. And it goes back all the way to our own evolution, as well as the evolution of the bees, as well as the whole kind of entire evolution of the planet. I know it sounds like a lot. I'm just throwing some of this stuff out there just because, like I said, I find it very interesting how not just we evolved as a species, but how our entire planet evolved, and how the plants, the insects, and people all sort of came together just in the last 2 or 3 million years. It's kind of a long process. So we're going to go back to start with about 150, 160 million years ago, which, you know, on the geological timescale isn't that long ago. But what started happening then is a new kind of plant came along, which are called angiosperms, which is just a fancy name for flowering plants, which means that they reproduce sexually by transmitting pollen. Before that, they still did that kind of reproduction, but the big change here with flowering plants is instead of a windborne plant like grasses and things like that, that the wind just scatters the pollen, the flowering plants, the pollen stayed on the flower, and it needed something to move the pollen around. And that's where insects came along. So as all these angiosperms started to develop about 160 million years ago, the first bees came along about 120 million years ago. And it's no coincidence, I think, that you see this explosion here in species at about that time. So basically, insects like bees are what get the job of reproduction done for plants. And at this point, 70%, 70 to 80%, depends on who you ask, of the world's plants are angiosperms. And about 90% of those need some sort of help in pollinating themselves and reproducing from an insect, a mammal, a bird, or some other creature that moves the pollen from one flower to another. So they're very important for all sorts of ecosystems, for biological diversity, and you know, if you think about it, a lot of the food that we eat today, the food that we have here, you know, the pickle that's in the wraps, the carrots, the celery, the broccoli, the cauliflower, all those things come from pollination. The cheese products all come from milk, which comes from alfalfa, which is a pollinated plant. Wind-pollinated species are still a big part of our diet, which are, you know, any of the grass species like wheat, barley, oats, corn. Those are all still wind-pollinated plants that are a big part of our diet, but we get a lot of nutrition from other plants that are flower pollinated. So here's a little quick chart of human evolution and bee evolution. So again, they've been around. Bees have a common ancestor that goes back about 120 million years, but let's see, this time scale is 15 to 20 million years ago. The first open nesting bees forked off and became what are called cavity nesting bees, which is where the honeybee and other bees around the world come from. The major species that people keep are Apis mellifera and Czarina, which is the Asian honeybee. So both of those types of bees are kept around the world for honey production. There's quite a few differences as far as honey production between the two species, and then these are the different subspecies that went to different continents. And then there was another subdivision here, and then another subdivision. Well, if you look at this, this is 1.65 million years ago, about 160,000 years ago. When did humans first come on the scene? About 200 to 300,000 years ago, same time that Apis mellifera came upon the scene. I just find that a little bit interesting. So one of the other things I'm going to touch on real quick is this is a common thing that you get into when you're into beekeeping is people think something's a bee when it's not a bee. And the reason is that bees belong to this order of insects called Hymenoptera, which accounts for 11% of all insect species. So there's a ton of Hymenoptera out there, and that's basically any sort of winged insect that has 6 legs. A lot of them have stingers. They look a lot like, some of them look very much like a honeybee, but technically any sort of bee has 4 wings, whereas a lot of those other Hymenoptera species only have 2 wings. And of course, different colorings, but unless you're an entomologist, it's really hard sometimes to identify those differences. So again, out of that, so that's 11% of the species are insects, and there's about 200,000 species of bees, or I'm sorry, 20,000 species of bees, but only 7 of them produce honey. So the fact that a honeybee produces honey it makes it a pretty special insect to begin with. And again, this is just a chart showing human evolution. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail there, other than it's just very interesting that this little blip here, down here, Homo sapiens, if you look at that, that's also in millions of years here in this chart, and that's at, maybe a 1/5 of the way over. So yeah, this is where humans come onto the scene as far as where honeybees were. So again, I just find it very interesting that there's that. Plus, here's the evolutionary migration of the 2 species. They believe that number 3 here is the correct model. It's, like a lot of things going back hundreds of thousands of years, it's really hard to trace where things developed and and how they spread. So there's these 3 different models for where the honeybee came from and how it spread. But they actually believe that number 3 is pretty close, which again is pretty darn close to the spread of humans from Africa. You have to be a believer in evolution, I guess, to go along with this. But I just find it very interesting that at least what is considered the most likely scenario is that humans and honeybees developed in the same continent and then did the same migration pattern out of that continent for the most part. They spread to the same places. So we have a very long history of humans and bees being together. I mean, it's very obvious that humans would have encountered honeybees in Africa well over 100,000 years ago. And it's also very obvious that people in that time would have robbed the honey from those bees. There's all sorts of evidence of that. But at some point, we know that they also, did I miss a slide here? Yeah, I'm going to go forward one and back one. So this is the only current historical records that document early humans in prehistory robbing from bee colonies. This one here is from a side of a cave or a cliff face. Same thing here. So, that's 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, we have documented cave paintings showing, hey, we're collecting honey from bees. And again, I'm going to go back. This is actual evidence of human beings actually keeping them in containers and harvesting the honey. So the one there on the left is from Israel, and that's from 1,000 years BCE. So we're looking at almost 3,000 years of documented evidence of people keeping bees for honey and wax. And then another one here on the right from about 2,700 years ago in Egypt. And so this is the other point, is that the bee has had a huge influence on our culture, cultures all around the world. They're overwhelmingly in everybody's stories around the world that involve bees and the magic of bees, and it really all revolves around honey, and also what I would suspect of brewing the honey into mead, because up until very, very recently, the 1800s, we didn't have a way to produce a sugar. So if you wanted sugar, if you wanted a sweetener of any kind, bees were the only way to get it. And so if you wanted to brew something, you either needed to know how to malt barley or wheat or rye or something like that to make a beer from, or you could just go harvest some honey, add some water to it, and wait for the magic to happen. So they know that that's been going on also for at least tens of thousands of years. Again, we saw that one. So yeah, the one on the left is from Spain, and the one on the right is from Africa. So, and smoke. Well, I'll cover that real quick. So one of the things that everybody's been using, for tens of thousands of years now is smoke to control bees. And how it works is bees communicate via pheromones. We were just talking a little bit ago about how when you get stung, I can smell it when I get stung. It releases a pheromone, and that actually is the alarm pheromone that tells the other bees there's a problem here. So it'll attract more bees to come to the threat and to try to drive it away. So having a smoker is the equivalent of, if we're trying to have a conversation in here, somebody with a bullhorn going, and we're trying to discuss, hey, there's somebody coming, oh, what did you say? I don't know. That's basically what it does. The other thing it does too is wild bees would have had to have reacted to smoke in several different ways. If they smell smoke, that means that there could be a fire coming to the tree that they're living in, which means they may have to leave really, really fast. So the other natural reflex that smoking bees does is it makes them go eat honey, because they want to get filled up in case they have to leave, because they want to have fuel for the trip. The whole colony may just have to leave if there's a fire coming to consume the tree that they're in. If that happens, they've already tanked up on honey, and they're ready to go. Well, when they do that, after they do that, they basically just kind of sit around and wait for it to happen or wait for it to go by. It's sort of like waiting for the fire alarm to get done. So And they actually get kind of calm and docile at that point. So it's that's the other reason why a beekeeper wants to smoke them, is not only does it cover up their pheromone response, but it also actually calms them down. So, as I said, ancient humans definitely had contact with bees, probably for over 100,000 years, much longer than we have any records for. And unfortunately, because bees are biological organisms and break down very quickly over time, the only remnants that you'd ever have of a beehive would be some of the wax, and even that breaks down fairly quickly. But it's pretty easy to guess that that's been a long history. All bees in general are important because they pollinate the plants, and these plants aren't just our food, they're plants that we use for medicine, for building materials, fuel, clothing, trade, and mead or alcohol. So there's all sorts of value-added stuff that pollination serves humanity on, and bees have always been a big driver for all those things. But honey, I think, is clearly what sets them apart as a species and why we have this relationship with them, because, again, there was nowhere else to get sweet stuff, just from bees. Bees also seem to like the same flowers that we do, even though they have way different visual mechanisms. They see more in the ultraviolet spectrum, which actually helps them navigate to flowers. So they basically, when you look at some of the flowers in the same way that a bee does, you can actually see what look like, here's the landing spots, here's where you go to find the nectar and the pollen. So I'm going to go over a little bit more here of the anatomy, biology, the caste of the bees, and then some of the specializations within the subspecies of the caste. So there's 3 castes of bees. I technically say it's 4 castes of bees, and I'll talk about that at the end. This is just a little thing I found on the internet that works really well for showing the differences in morphology. I mean, they're all the same animal, right? They're all bees, they all carry the same genes, but what's interesting is how they morph into different animals, basically. Based on whether the egg is unfertilized, it becomes a drone in about 24 days. The drones are bigger, they have different kinds of eyes. Drones don't do any foraging or any work of any kind, so they don't have the same kind of mouth parts, they don't have the same kind of internal organs. Their only function, really, is to breed with queens. That's their only function. Most of the population is worker bees, which comes from a fertilized egg, and they take about 21 days to go from egg to worker bee. Worker bees are female, but their reproductive organs have been suppressed. So that's just based on what they ate in the larval stage, and then that's continued on by the queen pheromone, also suppresses the development of ovaries later after those bees become adult. And then a queen bee also comes from a fertilized egg from another queen. This happens when, for whatever reason, the colony has gone queenless, or it's swarmed, or something like that, and they have to raise a new queen. They will take an egg out of a cell like this, and then they build special queen cells which actually hang upside down. So instead of being, bees do all their stuff normally horizontally, but the queen cells will be built, either they'll come out and then drop down, I'll have some pictures of them later, or they'll just build them clear at the bottom. And so that's one difference. And then they also feed that larva a different kind of food in the larval stage. And just based on that, she develops in only 16 days. She's bigger. She's about 30% bigger than a worker bee Different kind of stinger, has fully functioning ovaries, doesn't have the same eyes, doesn't have the same mouth parts. All those things are way different just because they fed her something different in the larval stage, which just completely blows my mind. So again, the major morphological differences between the three castes are they all have a stinger, but the stinger is basically turns into three different things. So in the drones, that becomes their phallus. In the workers, it becomes their stinger. And in the queen, it actually is an ovipositor that is used for depositing the eggs, but she also has a barbless stinger that is used to kill other queens. So going back to when I was talking about swarming, when honeybees swarm, they don't just raise one queen, they'll raise 5 or 6, however many they can. So the first queen that gets out hatches out, and then she uses her unbarbed stinger to kill the other queens. Whereas the worker bee's stinger is barbed. It's designed specifically to stick in mammal flesh. They can't really use it on other insects, which is why it comes out and they disembowel themselves and they die. Just like the drone does when he mates with a queen. He disembowels himself by inserting his phallus into the queen, and then he dies. It's a great life to be a male bee or any other male insect. That's actually very common in male insects. You don't want to be one. So, and as I said earlier, the queen also gives off a pheromone which suppresses the development of ovaries in the workers. And then what I call the fourth caste is the brood itself. So when they're in this stage here, this is what you call a larval stage, and then this is capped brood stage. That also emits pheromones, and that works to give cohesion to the colony and controls other factors. For instance, like if you've had a colony that's gone queenless and they haven't been able to raise their own queen and you have to introduce a new queen, it works a lot better if you can put some capped brood in the colony, because that pheromone helps the cohesiveness of the colony and they're going to be more accepting of that new queen. If you don't do that, the workers may not accept that new queen and might just kill her. So that's the other reason why I call it the fourth caste, even though they're not technically a caste, but they act like another entity within the hive. And then, so here's some real live pictures of the three different castes all next to each other: a queen, a drone, and a worker bee. And you can see the drone's eyes are way different. They're much bigger. And that's because what they do is, like I said, their only job is to go breed with a queen. So, you know, starting in May through this month, they go to what are called drone congregation areas, where this big cloud of drones will just fly around in the air and they're looking for a queen. And the queens are also attracted to those same areas for breeding. And that's what their big eyes are for. They're better to see them with. The queen bee, of course, is longer. She's got more stuff going on in her body because she's basically the egg-laying machine. And then the worker bees while they're smaller, they are also capable of doing a whole lot of different stuff. I hope you guys can see this. I can see it pretty clearly on my screen. But you can actually, if you look here, you can actually see there's an egg. They look like little tiny grains of rice in the bottom of the cells. A lot of people who start beekeeping and they're looking through it's one of the things you do when you inspect the hive is you're looking for eggs, because if you see an egg, that's just about as good as seeing a queen, because that egg, if it's actually an egg, it's only been there for about 24 hours because it quickly hatches out and becomes a larva, and then it goes through 5 different stages where it molts and before it pupates and becomes a worker bee. There's the queen cell I was telling you about that hangs upside down. These bigger ones here that look like bullets sticking out, That's drone cells. So they're slightly bigger. So again, the birds and the bees about the honeybees, it's not uncommon for bees to have separate sexes where they have this mechanism where the queen of the colony actually mates with several different drones, and then she actually stores all that semen, all that sperm for, in a honeybee's case, it could be up to 3 or 4 years, depending on how well bred she is. And ideally, they over a course of several days after she hatches out, so on day 16, she hatches out. Usually a day or so will go by before she starts doing her mating flights. And then in another 2 or 3 days, hopefully she's mated with as many as 20 drones. That adds, again, to the genetic diversity for the species. You want to make sure, and ideally those drones are from at least 6 different colonies of bees, so that you get good diversity within that colony. So, and again, she holds that sperm in a special organ, and then somehow or another, when she's laying eggs, she fertilizes some of them and doesn't fertilize other ones. That's another one of those things that people really don't know how that mechanism works, but they do that. But evidently that's not that uncommon. It's probably the same thing for like your queen ants in ant colonies, and wasps and hornets have a similar structure. And also, like all of the other native bees, like bumblebees and mason bees, also kind of operate the same way with that structure of. So worker bees, as the name implies, do most of the work within the colony. This gives a little chart about what bees do over the course of their lives. So first day or so after they hatch, they basically spend that cleaning up maybe the cell that they just came out of. So what happens is, I was telling you about how bees go through different larval stages, and the outside casing of those pupa, or those larvae, come off, and so they have to clean out some of that debris from the cell, and then that gets hauled out. Also, in another couple of weeks, they may start hauling bees or debris or other stuff that's on the bottom of the hive, hauling it out to the front door to get it out of there. And then also around that same time, they become what are called nurse bees. And nurse bees are the ones that take care of the eggs and the larvae that feed them the royal jelly that help them develop into worker bees, drones, or queens. After they get a few more weeks older, their wax glands develop and they can start building wax. It also has to be warm enough for them to do that. They do their own air conditioning in the hive. So you'll see bees sit at the front here with their butts facing out and just fanning like crazy. And they're just basically, they move air, they bring in water, they move air, and they can regulate the temperature and humidity within the colony within a few degrees and within a few percentage of moisture, because they have to dry the honey down. So, honey comes in as a liquid that's around 90% moisture, and to make it honey, it has to be dried to 18.6% moisture or less. That's the definition of honey, is 18.6% moisture or less. You can have honey that's really dry and it's like down to 16.5% moisture. But the minimum is 18.6. So they have all sorts of specialized glands and organs in their body. They have a honey stomach for gathering the nectar. They have the glands in their head for producing the royal jelly. They have their stinger. They have the venom sac and They have specialized foot parts that are designed to be soft in some cases so that they can, if they're on a smooth surface, they don't slip. And then they also have almost like clawed feet so that if they're trying to crawl on a stick or something like that, they can actually, you know, crawl up it. So they have very specialized feet. They also have what are called pollen baskets on their hind legs. We'll see another better picture of that here a little bit right here. So that's basically what honeybees and other bee species are designed to do, is draw pollen to their body. They're covered in hair, and that hair is electrostatic. So just getting in the presence of pollen kind of almost magnetically pulls it, or electrostatically pulls it into their body. That's why they get all covered like this. And then they basically rake it back to their hind legs so that they can take that pollen back to the colony, because they use that as part of what they feed to their brood. They make a mixture of nectar and pollen that's called bee bread. It partially ferments, and that's what the adult bees eat, and it helps them produce royal jelly for nursing the other bees. Honeybees are also very species specific. Most of the wild or native bees will just kind of go from plant to plant, flower to flower, just collecting pollen wherever they can get it. But when a honeybee goes out, it usually only works one kind of plant, which makes them very, very good for pollination for a crop. Because if your crop has a bunch of weeds growing around it, but your crop is in bloom and you want it pollinated, if that's the best nectar source, the bees will just stick with it. That's what they'll do. They won't bother going off to eat the milkweed or the whatever else. They'll stay on your crop. So this is a little chart here that talks about how they actually produce honey. So they go out, they bring in the nectar from the flower. They have a specialized tongue that works like a big straw that they can get in quite a ways within a flower, about almost the length of their body. They can probe into a flower to get nectar. They store it in their honey stomach. Their honey stomach also has the enzyme in it. If you're into brewing, that enzyme is the same that we use for converting starches into sugars, which is alpha amylase. That actually is in their stomach. So that also starts to break down the complex sugars that are in the nectar and turns them into more simpler sugars. They basically then, they have a honey stomach or a honey crop, which they go back to the colony and they'll regurgitate some of that to one of their sisters and say, hey, look at this, try some of this really great nectar I found. And that gets taken back and forth. Eventually they store it in the frame and they dry it and it becomes honey. And then they'll seal it off so that it doesn't draw moisture back into it, because as it is, once honey is produced at that 18.6% moisture, it actually is, the honey will draw moisture to itself. If you just leave honey out in an open container in a humid room, it'll start drawing moisture in it, which is also why honey works great on burns and cuts, because you can put honey on a burn or a cut, and because if you have any infection that starts or any weeping or seepage that occurs, the honey will absorb that and pull it away. And while it's doing that, it produces hydrogen peroxide while that happens. So that's why honey works so well for burns and cuts. And it's not just an old wives' tale. There's actual science behind how that works. Plus, honey itself, because it's so dry and it pulls moisture out of stuff, This is why bacteria normally doesn't grow in it, because bacteria and viruses and most other microorganisms need moisture to live. And what happens is the honey will literally suck the moisture out of their body and kill them. It basically will dehydrate those microorganisms. The only bacteria that survives in it is what's called the botulism bacteria, which is why you're not supposed to feed honey to infants, because the botulism virus or bacteria, well, once you're about 2 years old, your body has built up an immunity to it, but the spores of the botulism bacteria are so hard that the honey can't pull anything out of them. So that's why as soon as honey gets introduced to moisture, like if you put it in your mouth or you cook with it or something like that, those botulism spores will come back to life, and that can be harmful to infants. But otherwise, microorganisms don't live in the presence of honey. And then this other little slide here is also more about the foraging behavior. They don't just get nectar, they get and pollen. They also collect water, as I was talking about. They need that for air conditioning. And another thing that they get is called propolis, which is basically tree saps and resins. And let me see if I've got some. Yeah, so I'm going to pass this around. This stuff that's on the edges right here is propolis. And it's like wax, but it's much harder. And if you break off a little bit of it and you smell it, sometimes it smells like pine, because pine is one of the main species that they gather the sap from to make propolis. Propolis is also very is detrimental to any sort of microorganism. They use it to line the outside of their colony. Anywhere that they don't put wax to hold things together, they put propolis, which actually is I think it's a Greek or, anyway, it means before polis, city, so before the city. That's what it means. So, up until the 1850s, beekeeping was done in skeps, or it was just you wild harvested it. And the reason was because people didn't have any way to harvest honey without destroying the comb. So what you're seeing there is what is called, oh, I misspelled my thing there, hivo. That's what happens when you're trying to throw a presentation together quickly. The Langstroth hive was developed in the 1850s by this guy, Reverend Lorenzo Lorraine Langstroth, here in the United States in the 1850s. Him and a Polish beekeeper were doing some corresponding. They were trying to, at this time, people were experimenting with boxes like this and frames and trying to figure out how to have removable frames, because, like you said, up until this point, you kept them in either a straw skep or a clay pot or something like that, and if you wanted to harvest honey, you had to actually cut those out, and then you had to put them in a bag or something, or just mash it with your hands to get the honey out. And then you're destroying the wax, and you can't, and if you want to look and see what's going on inside the colony, you can't. So people thought, well, wouldn't it be really great if we could have frames that we could take out, look at it, remove the wax. So that's what was going on in the 1850s, and they finally came up with it. And so what we do now is we have these frames like this. This is actually a frame of foundation, what's called foundation. It's plastic, and it has beeswax on it, and then the bees draw it, they do what's called drawing it out. You can see where they're starting to draw it out here, but most of it is not drawn out.
How long can you reuse
3 to 5 years, and actually what they're saying now is 3 years is probably the longest you want to go.
Why is that?
Because of all the problems with diseases and pests that you can have if you use it for much longer than that. What I have found is, and this is a little more advanced area of beekeeping, but if you can control and manipulate the hive correctly, what you try to do is to keep your brood production, the production of the baby bees done in your lower frames and then your honey in the top ones. The honey frames, you could probably reuse those for many, 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 many years because there isn't that brood production going on in there where you have the molting of the skins of the larva. If it's only ever just has honey in it, it's not a big deal. The honey itself is sterile and clean, and you extract it out, you put that extracted frame back on, the bees clean it up, they refill it. So those you could probably reuse for many, many, many years. But if the frame has been used for more than 2 or 3 years for brood production, the comb will look much darker, and after those number of years, you should probably replace it. So the essential thing for modern beekeeping was figuring out what bee space is, which is the distance that's acceptable to leave open where they won't draw comb, where they won't put propolis. So if it's too wide of a gap, they'll do what's called brace comb or burr comb, and they'll fill it in with comb, and then it's stuck together. If it's really short and the bee can't get through it, they'll fill it with propolis. So, but there was this magic distance, which is about 3/8, between 5/16 and 7/16 of an inch, or not, yeah, about 7/16 of an inch, where if it's that distance, the bees will just leave it open because they can easily crawl through that. And they like to have places that they can go around and crawl through the hive. They don't want to close every corridor off. So that's basically how a length-stroke hive and all the parts that go into it are developed to accommodate this idea of bee space, keeping that 3/8 of an inch or so gap all the way around so that you can always remove the frames. Now, they still stick the frames together at the top and stuff like that, but if you use your hive tool, it's pretty easy to just pry them apart. It's much, much harder if they start to tie the wax into the edge of the frame or the edge of the wall of the hive body. You have a heck of a time trying to get it out if they do that. So here's actually some natural drawn comb that actually, you can see that they follow bee space right there. So again, it's about 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch. This says 1 centimeter, it should say 10 centimeters. And this was, it's funny that it took people this long to figure it out, but essentially this is what revolutionized beekeeping, and really the technology that we're using today is from the 1850s. This is not a lot different than a hive that you would have had in the 1850s. The basic parts of the hive are you've got a stand, a bottom board. Look at this here. I use what are called screened bottom boards, and that's for better airflow, and it's also for, it helps a little bit with the control of the Varroa Mite, which we'll go into more later. And then this is your hive body. They're also called supers, for superimpose. So you have your bottom board, you're going to put your hive body, and you can put as many as you need on there. Then when you're ready to top it off, oh, if you want to, you can keep the queen out of specific hive bodies by using what's called a queen excluder. This space is wide enough for worker bees to get through, but just a little too narrow for a queen. This comes in very handy when you're trying to find the queen in the colony and you can't. Then you basically just top it off with what's called an inner cover. And then this is the telescoping cover, which keeps rain out of it and that kind of stuff. This is what's called an entrance reducer. So you would use this in the spring and in the fall. It has a couple of different modes of operation, that a little wider hole for them and a really narrow hole that you would use. It also helps with you're trying to stop bees from robbing each other. Sometimes what happens is if you get a colony that's very weak and they have some honey stored in it, a stronger colony will come and start just hammering them. And if they have this big long opening that they can get in, the lower population of that weaker hive will just basically give up and let them rob them out. But if you close it down so that they have just this little tiny hole that they can get in and out of the colony, even a weaker colony can defend itself pretty well at that point. So those are the major parts of a hive. And then there's some other equipment. Of course, we have the smoker. We talked about the smoker. And the most important tool besides the smoker is your hive tool. Don't go beekeeping without a smoker and a hive tool. And don't go in a black shirt. Nothing says bear like a black shirt. And bees don't like bears. In general, European honeybees are very, what they call gentle. Most of the time, when I work my bees, I just use a little bit of smoke, and I don't put on a veil or gloves unless I'm going to be doing something like checking for mites, extracting or harvesting honey. If I'm just doing what I would call a standard hive check, where I'm looking for brood, seeing what the honey stores look like, that kind of stuff, they don't get agitated. If they do, there's usually something else that's caused that. Our European bees are bred to be very gentle, which means that they don't have a really aggressive response. And that's really the only difference between what you would call an African bee and a Western honeybee. Is what we have is the African bees have a much stronger response to defend their colony. And that's because of where they evolved. Some of the other stuff that I didn't really have room to bring, all this stuff, I didn't want to bring my extractor and stuff, but I use a device like this. It's a knife that you plug in, it heats up, and it basically cuts the outside cappings, the wax cappings off of the honey. You basically stick into a centrifuge extractor, you spin it out, it's got a little gate that you open up, you strain out the wax and bee parts that happen to be in there, and you got honey. One of those, the big frame that went around, that'll hold around 4.5 or 5 pounds of honey. The little ones are about 3. No, the medium actually.
What do you do with the wax?
I usually collect the wax and melt it down. Usually put it in a pot of water and you boil it, and then you just let it cool, and then all the debris settles on the bottom, and you can scrape that off, and then you have just clean wax. But don't put your pot of wax and water on the stove and go to bed, because if you do that, your kitchen will burn down.
Yeah.
You'll wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and have to put a fire out in your kitchen.
But do you use the wax?
Yeah, I've used the wax for, it's just like it's always been used. You can use it in cosmetics. My wife and I used to do farmers markets and stuff, and we'd make like lip balm and hand lotion and stuff out of the wax. Obviously you can make candles out of it. There's lots of other uses for beeswax, and that's one of the other reasons why people would have interacted with bees throughout history, because of the uses that you would have had with wax. They know that beeswax has been used in cosmetics for thousands of years as well. So if you're wanting to get started, once you have your equipment and you want to get started, you have about 3 ways that you can start a colony of bees. You can buy a nuke or a package, that's what we have here, or you can try to catch a swarm, like here. So, which I've done that before. It's actually not that hard, but it's not necessarily a beginner thing. So a nuke, or is just short for a nucleus, it's probably the most reliable way to get started because what you're getting, and these range from either 3-frame or 5-frame. This one looks like it's a 5-frame nuke. So basically, this is going to have a bunch of bees, I would guess between 3 to 4 pounds of bees. A pound of bees is about 3,500 bees. So that would be around 14,000 bees, which is pretty good. A good sized colony will be around 50 or 60,000 bees once it's peaked out in the summer. But that's a really good way to get your colony started. You have a laying queen, you're going to have brood already going in there, so the next generation of bees is ready to come online as those older workers die off. There's honey and pollen in there. And like I said, you have a queen that's already laying eggs. So that's a big thing. But they're usually almost twice of what you buy a package for. And this is what a package is. So basically, when they make packages of bees, and they do this in the South because they start this in February. And you can't really do that here in the North. They go around, they have a bunch of different colonies that they've overwintered, and because it's in the South and they have much better weather, they can go out and they can just start shaking bees from all those different colonies into these containers. And they do them in 2-pound, 3-pound, or 4-pound packages. And then they also, in a separate location, they'll be raising their queens, and they'll put the queens in a little cage like this. And usually they'll put 3 or 4 or 5 worker bees in with that queen. They're called attendant bees because the queen doesn't feed herself. And then they stick that in there, and then they put a jar or a can of sugar water in here, and this is either shipped via truck or U.S. Postal Service. This is how bees have been shipped for, well, 200 years. Is a variation of this, the same thing. So I'll pass this around so people can see. This was a 3-pound package.
When you buy the hive, what do you buy? He shows the plastic sheet.
Oh, when you buy a hive?
Or parts of hives.
Here. There. So this would be your 10-frame. So there are people who do what are called 8-frame, which is just, slightly smaller, just because it's lighter. These things get really heavy now that I'm almost 50 years old. It's hard for me to lift that when it's full of honey. That weighs about 80 pounds when it's full of honey. And it's not easy to move around. And that's 10-frame equipment. That's called a deep super. They're 9 5/8 inches is the depth of the frame. And the medium, there was a medium frame that went around, they're about 3 inches shorter, and so they weigh significantly less. So this would be the starter pack that you would get if you were going to be a starting beekeeper, is you'd buy this one here or this one here. And so this is a good one because it comes with two fulls and a medium, and then all the other equipment that you need to put in there. It's got your smoker, your veil, it's got some fuel for the smoker, gloves, your hive tool, all that good stuff. And that's for a package of bees. They're probably not going to outgrow that the first year. That going from brand new foundation where they have to draw out that foundation and make a whole lot of comb or a whole lot of beeswax, that's probably about all they're going to be able to do for the first year. But the second year, if assuming that they survive the winter, you're probably going to need a setup closer to this to house all those bees.
So what do you do with them in the winter?
You basically make sure that they're in an area where they're protected from the wind, but you still want to make sure that they have plenty of ventilation. I've done this very recently. I killed off colonies of bees because I didn't have enough ventilation for them.
So winter weather is not a problem?
No, they do not hibernate. The inside temperature of the cluster stays around 82 to 85 degrees all winter long. And then either sometime late in January or February, they'll start consuming more honey, and they'll raise that internal temperature to 92.5 degrees so they can start rearing brood. That's the minimum temperature that they need to raise babies, to raise baby bees. And they started, actually I had colonies that died off in late January, and when I took them apart, there was sealed brood in them, which means that 2 weeks before that, they had had the temperature up to 92.5 degrees in the beginning of January of this last year.
Poor ventilation.
Yep.
What you have them kept that was not significant.
I didn't.
Put them in a shop or?
No, they're outside, but I should have done a different thing on the top. I should have made sure that there was a little more space. I usually cut a little slit like this, and it probably needs to be a little bigger. And it's kind of weird because sometimes I've done it the way that I did it this last year many years, and it wasn't a problem. But I think it was because there was so much honey in there, and they were consuming a lot of honey. So that's what happens. Is the other thing that I always tell people why ventilation is so important is we go back to that 18.6% moisture. So let's call it 20% because it's a lot easier number to figure. So, and what we try to do in the north here is we try to leave 70 to 80 pounds of honey. So if 20% of that is moisture, and you got 80 pounds of honey on there, that's 16 pounds of water. That's 2 gallons of water. So while they're eating honey, they're respirating that water vapor. 2 gallons of water has to leave that colony somehow. If that doesn't happen, that causes that's where you start having the problems with lack of ventilation. That's what kills bees. Not because it gets too cold. I mean, it can get too cold and kill them, especially if they don't have enough honey resources. But lack of ventilation kills more bees than cold.
I think I've heard of people going south with
Mm-hmm.
why.
Oh, again, they don't even have to cluster. They can take all the honey off. That's what the big commercial guys do. Is they take them up here to actually they go to like North Dakota and South Dakota where they have the most CRP land for honey production, and then in the fall they take them down to Florida or Texas or somewhere to overwinter them, so that they don't have to, and then they can harvest a little honey. And when they take them down there, they probably just feed them high fructose corn syrup.
Do you change out your bases or anything for winter or do anything different with that?
As far as, I'm sorry, what was the first part?
The bases, do you do anything?
Oh, no, actually you want to have, again, for ventilation, you want to have this. I mean, I put them on a pallet. They're on a pallet and they have this on the bottom.
You change your entrance gate
Yep,
for the winter?
yep. Actually, the guy that, he's in Minnesota, what he says he does is he gets number 8 wire or number 8 mesh and just sticks that there, because that's the other problem you can have is mice will try to get in the winter. And he does that just to keep the mice out.
Do you reduce the size of your entrance in the winter, or do you leave it big? Or?
I usually do, but like I say, this other guy who's in Minnesota, he doesn't. He says all he does is he puts that hardware cloth in that's just wide enough for the bees to get in and out, keeps the mice out, and then it's just completely open. The front of it is completely open to the air.
There's no risk of them getting too cold then? Because
Well, again, I think a lot of it still comes down to you want to put them in a place where they're not exposed to high wind.
you pull the queen excluder out in the winter?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
What is the life cycle time?
Yeah. So in the hive, in the winter, do they bundle
Yep, they stay in a cluster.
and move up the hive, right?
Yep.
Queen's usually like in the center of that? Right, or-
That's basically where you want to make sure the honey is mostly on the center, yeah.
So you take the honey from the edges?
You can, but it's also nice to have some honey on the edges because that also acts as a form of insulation too. So that's the other weird thing that when you're talking about how they keep it warm and stuff like that, bees, like I said, bees have 4 wings. What they actually do is they have a way, somehow they can disconnect their wings from their muscles. What they do is then they go into one of the cells and they just start vibrating those muscles. And that's how they generate heat energy. And then when they get tired of that, they come back out, they go to the outside of the cluster, and then one of the ones that's gotten cold goes to the inside of the cluster and does that. I mean, and that whole process just goes on all winter long. Yep.
Have you seen them? Do they go out? I read that they go out and defecate sometimes.
Yes.
Have you seen them outside of the hive?
Oh yeah. They don't fly unless it's about 50 or 55 degrees. But if you have a January, February thaw day where it may only get up to like 35 degrees or 40 degrees, the bees will be outside the hive. You'll see them come outside the hive.
Crawling or?
Yeah, crawling around on the outside of the hive. And they do that because they don't normally, they'll hold it for months. They will not defecate in their hive. So that's also why they end up getting nosema and dysentery. Because their bowels can get impacted and then they can get either a bacterial or a fungal infection in their bowels because they've had to hold it that long. So, or the other thing that you'll see sometimes is if it does get to about 45, they'll also do what's called a cleansing flight. Well, they'll just fly and come back and they try to defecate away from the colony. But what you'll see a lot of times in those times of year is you have this inner cover on it like this, and there's enough room for a bee to get through there. And so what they'll do then is when you put this on here like this, you make sure that there's a little space in the front like this so they can get out. So they'll crawl out there, come down, and they'll go right there, and you'll see like reddish orange stuff right there because that's where they come out to poop. Yeah, that's what they do. So,
Is there ever like a period, is there anything you can do to assist them if it is like a really harsh, long, cold spell?
some people wrap their hives in black plastic, or not plastic, but like black tar paper. That helps. Other people just do, if they don't have them in a place where there's a really good windbreak, I've heard other people they'll just take like a couple of T-posts, they'll put them in the ground, and they'll basically make a straw or hay bale barrier for the wind to kind of make a wedge-shaped thing like this and point that into the prevailing winds, which would be to the northwest here, and then they place their hive over there. So those are the kinds of things that you do for management. It comes down to hive placement and just knowing the environment that you're in to try to put them in a place where they're going to be able to survive the winter and making sure they have enough honey.
One more question. Wasps.
What was that?
Do wasps pose a threat to the bees?
Not a significant threat, no. Wish we had more time. The Japanese honeybee encounters a giant hornet that is terribly, terribly destructive to bee colonies. But honeybees in general, have a higher temperature tolerance than other insects. And so what the Japanese honeybee does is these giant hornets, they send out a scout. And the scout then marks the colony with her pheromone. And then it only takes like 30 or 40 of these giant hornets to decimate a hive of 30,000, 40,000 bees. Because again, the worker bees have a stinger, but it's not effective against other insects. So what these bees in Japan have figured out to do is they let that scout hornet come in. They let her get all the way in the nest. And then somehow they all communicate to each other and say, baller. And they all mob her. They all disconnect their wing muscles. They start generating heat. And there's a video on the internet. You should check it out. And they have an infrared camera. And the center of that ball gets to 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And they cook that hornet. The bees can handle that temperature, but the wasp or the hornet can't. It's about a 2-degree difference between what the bee can handle and what the wasp or the hornet can handle. It's pretty amazing. Because if they don't do that, 30 or 40 of those giant hornets are going to come and it'll decimate that colony. They just chew them up. So now that we've gotten some bees in our colony, we either bought a package or we bought a nuke or we caught a swarm. We're going to have to manage them throughout the year. So really the beekeeping year starts back here. We're about 6 months too late if you wanted to start beekeeping this year, because this is when you have to buy equipment and get your bees reserved if you're going to get a package or buy a nuke. Nukes and packages are sometimes available as late as March, April, or May. The packages usually come this time of year, in April, sometimes as late as May. And the reason for that is you really want to, even here in the north, you want to get started, you want that colony to get started as early as you can, because you start having pretty good nectar flows sometimes as early as May. And so if you're starting out with a package in April that you got on the 15th of April and it's a 3-pound package, that's only 10,000 bees, that's not a very big workforce to work a nectar flow. The bigger the workforce is, the more efficiently they work nectar flows. The most efficient colonies are the biggest colonies. And they can approach 60,000 bees or even more in really, really, really big ones. And it depends, and that's all really dependent upon how well your queen lays and other environmental conditions, because it's basically what drives the queen to lay is how much food the workers are feeding her, which is based on how much nectar they're bringing in. So that's how a queen goes from laying no eggs in the middle of winter to 1,500 to 2,000 a day in the middle of summer. So you get in your package in April, you're watching your overwintered colonies to make sure that they're not swarming, and you're just doing your regular management where you're checking the brood, checking on the queens, making sure there's no disease problems. This is also this isn't on this chart, but this is also when I would do my first check for Varroa mites, which we're going to go into a little more detail later. If you already have a honey flow, you might add a super already, but you definitely want to do one by June. If your colonies are building up and they're doing well, you're definitely going to want to add more hive bodies. Depends on the year. I have, on one of my colonies here in Spencer, I have about 8 frames of honey I could harvest right now. But I've had years where I've harvested in June. But usually by July, there's some honey to harvest, definitely by August. And then Labor Day, or sometimes a little later than that, is usually when people do want to definitely harvest any excess honey. And depending on the year, you might still get some nectar flows. And then, the making candles would be another thing that you can do with the wax. As I was talking about, once you extract honey, you're going to have some wax left over, or if you're recycling some of your old comb, you'd be melting that wax down. Feeding honeybees is, feeding honeybees is basically you make up a mix of sugar water, which in the spring it's 1 part water to 1 part sugar, and it doesn't matter if that's by weight or by volume. In the fall, you do 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. And the other thing you can feed them are what are called pollen patties. It's basically a pollen substitute. It's the protein that they need for raising the baby bees. You'd only, again, that's something you'd only do in the spring. By this time of year, by the end of September and October, you're hoping that the queen is shutting down egg production because the longer that goes on, the more honey they're going to need to survive the winter. So in October and November, it's definitely time to prep your hive for winter. You're going to take it from, in the summer, you may have had 4 or 5 boxes deep on here. And again, depending on the size of the hive, you're going to get down to 2. And I've had really big colonies where even trying to get them down to 3 full-size boxes, there was just too many bees. Had to have 3 boxes. Normally, you get them into 2 for the winter. There isn't much to do in December, although one of the other things that is different about that, though, now is, and again, this goes back to treating for Varroa mites, is that's another time, November and December might be another time that you would treat for the Varroa mite using oxalic acid, which is an organic acid that kills the mites on the adult bees. It doesn't penetrate the brood, which is why this is a good time to do it, because by October, the queen shouldn't be laying anymore, hopefully, which means that any of the mites that are in your hive are on adult bees and not in the brood, or because there isn't any brood. So we'll get right into the mites. So the Varroa mite is the thing that every beekeeper in the United States is going to has to deal with. They're all over. You can't, if you have bees, if you're keeping bees, you're keeping mites. They came into our country in the 1980s. They're originally from Asia. They jumped species from Apis cerina to Apis mellifera sometime a few hundred years ago, and now they're all over this country. There's only one, I think New Zealand is the only place that doesn't have Varroa mites. So it's a parasitic mite. It basically, and its life cycle is linked to that of the brood cycle of the bees. So how the mite has to develop is the queen mite goes in once the bee is in what's called the 5th instar stage, which is the last stage before it pupates. She'll crawl in there and she'll step aside or get to one corner of the chamber of the cell as the bee pupates and spins its cocoon. And then she'll crawl back in. She attaches itself to the bee, feeds on it, and starts laying eggs. And then so they develop, I mean, this is going to sound disgusting, sorry, but this is how it works. So they hatch out really fast. She'll lay her first egg within 60 hours of that time, and then they develop into fully sexually active mites very quickly. Some of them male, some of them female. And the brothers and sisters then get it on and have even more mites. Yeah, that's how they reproduce. So that's a fully developed mite, and these little translucent ones are ones that are still developing. So in the course of the 21 days that the worker bee is in the cell, the mite goes in at about day 5. So she has about 16 days. Again, she starts at 60 hours, and then she lays an egg every 30 hours after that. So they can produce on average 1.5 to 2 more viable mites every brood cycle that she goes in. So what happens is, if you have an explosion of bee population, you also have an explosion of mites. And that's where you start having problems, because all the diseases that bees, well, I shouldn't say all of them, but most of the diseases bees can get are transmitted from bee to bee by the mites. Just like you can get, West Nile from a mosquito, different viruses that bees get or can get are transmitted via the mites. So there's viral and bacterial diseases that spread throughout the colony. The only one that would be different than that would be nosema, which is mostly just affects adult bees, and that's a protozoan infection. So all the viral and bacterial infections, though, spread usually during the larval stage of development. Now, that will still affect the adults, but because all this stuff happens in the larval stage, the University of Minnesota came up with this idea of what if the bees could sense disease in the brood and remove the brood before the infection spreads. And I'm just going to quickly go to here. So that's basically what this is. This is called hygienic behavior. And to test for hygienic behavior, now it's pretty easy to see there. What they do is they take a frame of brood, and they measured out this area to be 100 cells, and they put this ring on. They pour liquid nitrogen on it. It kills all the brood. Then they stick it back in. They wait for that to thaw out. They stick it back in the hive, and then they see how long it takes the worker population to remove most of the 100 dead brood. And then they bred for that trait, basically how quickly they do that. And when they did that, they also figured out that that same trait of removing dead brood quickly also could sense Varroa infection, foul brood infection. I'm going to go back a couple slides here. Foul brood is a bacterial infection, which is really, really nasty. You don't want to get it. You'll have to destroy your colony and your equipment. The fungal infections, all of them, if when they bred for this behavior, basically stopped all of those in their tracks. The problem is it's hard to keep that trait going in the bees. But there's still research being done at the University of Minnesota for that. One of the other bigger issues that Varroa causes is just by the bee having this mite attached to it, it's like having any other disease organism. Your body's trying to fight it off. The bees have only one defense mechanism that they use. It's a specific enzyme that gets rid of toxins in their body. We have a liver that does that for us. Bees don't have a liver. They have one enzyme in their body that destroys toxins so that they can go through their body without killing them. The problem is that if they get multiple forms of stress or multiple forms of toxin in their body, it'll just start to kill them. So that's basically one of the leading causes of what they think causes colony collapse disorder, is the fact that it's not just mites, it's not just pesticides, it's not just all these other things. It's the fact that bees get put under too much stress all at once. But Varroa is still the common factor in.
How do you treat the Varroa?
That's a good question. So there's a couple of different things. I just was at a class on Sunday Again, there's a guy from the University of Minnesota who is teaching the class on managing the Varroa Mite. And what they're recommending now, there's several, I call them organic because they're based either on thymol, formic acid, or oxalic acid, which are all organic compounds. The issue with all of them is that even though they're not completely toxic to bees, they still are detrimental. So anytime you treat, you're still doing some harm to the bees.
How do you administer it? Is it liquid form?
Some of them are liquid. So the other issue with them is they're all temperature sensitive. So like the thymol treatments, you have to have a specific temperature range that they work with. Because if it's too cold, the vapors don't get around the colony and kill mites. If it's too hot, they disperse too fast and you just lose it all. The same with formic acid, does the same thing. There's a very specific temperature range that you have to use formic acid. And that formic acid basically comes in little gel patties that you stick between two hive bodies where there's brood. And then you leave them on for a week or 10 days, and it does a pretty good job of killing the mites. Oxalic acid can be administered in a couple of different ways. You can either make a liquid form of it that you would basically just drizzle over the bees in between the frames, and there's also a vaporization method where basically you take a tiny little heating coil and you put just a few grams of it in there, you stick it in there, hook it up to a car battery, it heats up really hot and smokes it. But oxalic acid doesn't penetrate into the brood. And you don't want to do it during what's called a honey flow when you're trying to harvest honey from that colony. So there's all sorts of different things. But those are the three main treatments: thymol, formic acid, and oxalic acid. And you would use formic acid in May or late fall when it's cooler weather. Some in late spring, early summer to late summer, early fall, you could use thymol. And then when the bees aren't producing any brood at all, and when there's no honey going on, is when you'd use oxalic acid.
That'd be in the fall.
Yep. So again, all these things are kind of tied together. Pests, the pathogens, climate, nutrition, pesticides, management practices, and the bee genetics themselves, going back to how well they take care of the pathogens when they're in their own colony. Pesticides are a big deal, I think, but to me it also comes down to what can I manage. I can't really manage the pesticides. They're out there, they're not going to go away. I can do my best to place my bees in places where they're not going to be exposed to as many. I can't control the climate. I can control the nutrition to some extent because I can make sure I place my bees in a place where there's lots of different florals and nectar sources. I can work on my management practices, make sure they're not overcrowded. I'm not going to spend a lot of time moving them around, stressing them by that. I'm going to treat for the parasites when they have them. And I know how to recognize the various viruses and stuff here. The most common virus, which actually isn't even in the list here, and when you hear the name of it, you'll see why it's so easy to recognize. It's called deformed wing virus. Guess what it does? So, and again, it's primarily transmitted by the Varroa Mite. So that's another good sign that you have Varroa mites if you see bees that have deformed wings. The long-term goal that myself and there's actually a beekeeping club here that regularly meets either in Spencer or at Dickinson County Nature Center. And our long-term goal is to breed bees that can coexist with lower levels of mites that don't kill off the colony, and we don't have to do as much of the ongoing treatments. Like I said, at this point though, if you're keeping bees, you're keeping mites. And you have to monitor the mites levels. And what we're looking for right now, and that's what this little thing here is. This is how I check for mites. The University of Minnesota and Michigan and Maryland put this little testing kit together. And it's basically like a mason jar that has a screen in it. And you can see I've used it because it's full of powdered sugar. So you have this, and this is my special cup with a little mark on it here. When I get bees up to this level, that's 300 bees, I pour them in here, put the lid on, I put about 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar on it, I shake the crap out of it.
You say this is 300 bees to that level?
Yep. 100 milliliters of bees is 300. They did the study in University of Minnesota. They did lots and lots of tests. 100 milliliters of bees were approximately a half a cup.
But why is the University of Iowa or Iowa State University more appropriately maybe not involved in this sort of thing?
I think it's mostly because University of Minnesota actually has an entomology department. They don't really have a big entomology department. Also, and actually I took a course from her. This is the woman who came up with the concept and breeding for hygienic behavior. Her name is Marla Spivak, and she's at the University of Minnesota. She's been one of the main people spearheading this research.
They're also involved in horticulture, unlike
Yep.
what we know here.
Yeah. So let me just quickly finish up. So what you do then is once you roll the bees around in the powdered sugar, and what that does is it creates some friction and some heat, and it dislodges the mites from the bodies of the bees. And then the screen is the right size so that as you shake them out, you're going to get some powdered sugar and you're going to get the mites out. And then you shake them into the bottom of this thing. And it's sometimes a little hard to see them, but if you put a little water in, it dissolves the sugar, and then you can count the mites. So what you're looking for in 300 bees is you're looking for 9 or less mites, which would be a 3% mite load, 3 per every 100 bee. If it's over that, you probably should treat. If it's less than that, don't treat, because that means the bees are probably holding their own against the mites. And again, treating for the mites also has some detrimental effects on the bees. So you don't want to over-treat and make things worse just because you have 2 or 3 mites per 100 bees.
How often are you checking for these mites?
During the summer months, you should be checking as soon as you can in the spring, which would be sometime in May, and then you should be checking probably every other brood cycle, which would be every 6 weeks, all the way through the fall. And the biggest issue, and again, this is a very long discussion, but the biggest issue is what are called the phoretic mites. Phoretic mites are the mites that live on the adult bees. And the biggest issue with that is if you have a fairly big mite load going into winter, those winter bees or fall bees, whatever you want to call them, they're the only ones that survive, the only worker bees that survive for any length of time. Most of the bees that are produced in a colony die off within 6 or 8 weeks. But the bees that are raised at the end of the year in the fall, they have to live and stay in that hive throughout the winter. And if they have mites on them, that's very detrimental to them. And what that means is if there's sufficient mite population, again, as soon as that colony starts rearing brood in the late winter, your mite population is going to skyrocket. And this is exactly what beekeepers like me who've been doing it for 10 or 15 years or more have seen in the last 5 or 6 years. Is you can have colonies that look fantastic going into winter, tons and tons of bees, lots of honey. They look good as late as February or March, and then April or May, they're all dead. And it's what's happened is as that colony was ramping up, the mite load got to the point where the bees either just abscond, which means they give up the colony, or they collapse. So it's the reality that you have to do if you're a beekeeper. Is you have to deal with them. The last part I'm going to talk about, which is also very fascinating to me, is their communication, their efficiency, and how that's been used in computer modeling. So a lot of people have heard of the bee dance or the waggle dance. This is kind of a diagram of how it works. The worker bee goes out, finds some resource, and this, because they use this for lots of different things. It's not just for gathering nectar and pollen. They also do it for water, and if they're looking for a new hive location, they use the same communication method. So she'll come back, she'll do a little dance along the frame of the hive, and depending on the orientation, that's the orientation of the sun. Depending on the angle that they go across the frame, that's the same. That's compared to the angle of the sun. And so when the bee leaves the hive, they saw her do this dance at this angle, and so when they leave the hive, they fly at that angle compared to the sun. That's how they navigate. And then the distance is communicated by how they do the dance, whether it's a round dance, a crescent dance. Those all communicate different lengths that they fly. So they use this algorithm where bees they go out, they check out a nectar source, they come back, they tell them where it's at. It's like auditioning, or you're basically trying to, or not auditioning, but like marketing. They're trying to sell this nectar source. It's like, hey, look at this, I found this. And the more enthusiastic the worker bee is too, the more likely it is that she's going to recruit other worker bees to go exploit that nectar resource. And then eventually what happens is those other worker bees come back and they also will do that dance. And then pretty soon you have a large number of bees working this nectar source until it stops. And then the stop mechanism is also in there. So while the worker bee is doing her waggle dance, if one of the other worker bees has also been to that location and they know something negative about it, they do what's called the stop bump. So they'll just basically do a real short buzz. I mean, it basically sounds like no or stop, and they run into the other bee, literally. It's like, zzz. So you're here doing this nice little happy dance, Hey, go over here, zzz. No, oh, okay. That's what they do. So, and it's interesting to me because you kind of need that mechanism, because otherwise it's just always about, hey, this is great, this is great, this is great. Well, somebody's got to be able to say, it's really not that great. When I was there was a dead bee there. So they've done this, they've looked at this, and they figured out this in the 1980s sometime, and then 15 years later, when people started doing cloud computing and other stuff, where you had all this automatic load balancing stuff that people were trying to figure out, they were having a hell of a time with it. And they went to these researchers who did the waggle dance and the bee communication, and they applied that model to cloud-based computing, and it worked perfectly. Pretty amazing. So they, like I said, they also use it for trying to find a new hive location if they're swarming. I really like the bees voting. And then here's another, like I said, it's not just about the positive feedback. They can have the stop signal in there. And once that happens, then that's basically how they make a decision between, you know, if they were doing this decision of, should we do the old stump, the elm, the birch, or the oak tree, eventually somebody's going to probably do a stop and say, no, this site really isn't good. And so what happens is basically the entire colony comes to a consensus on this is where we're going to go, this is what we're going to do. And so when that happens, they're all perfectly happy about it. It's not like there's some argument that occurs. They basically just, it goes through this iteration of go check it out, see what you think, come back, tell us what you think. And it's pretty amazing. So the last thing I wanted to end on is, you know, hopefully after all you've learned here about bees, that it was a couple years ago now, people were talking about building these robotic bees because in response to colony collapse disorder, because, you know, the reality is we could end up not having honeybees if we don't really take care of this Varroa Mite and colony collapse disorder, which would be a horrible thing because we rely upon honeybees for so much of our pollination right now. Almonds alone are a $2 billion crop. Pollination by bee colonies in the United States alone is somewhere between $20 and $25 billion annually. So, you know, these people started thinking, well, we'll just make robot bees. They'll go out and pollinate crops. Okay, we do have nice little robots that can fly around, but there's a little more to pollinating than flying around. Where's the fur on this? How does the pollen going to get attracted to the body? How does this thing know where to land on a flower? How does it know what the wind conditions are like or the humidity? But, you know, it's a great idea. I think it's a great thing to look at as far as scientifically to understand how complex the system is. But I don't think it's a very realistic goal to try to, you know, to figure out how to make them do all the stuff. So I came up with a little number here. So going back to the almond groves in California, it requires 85% of all the colonies that are kept in the United States for pollination. I'm not talking about people who don't do pollination services like myself, that I don't rent my hives out for pollination, but that's where the money in beekeeping is. It's about 1.7 million colonies are transported to California in February every year to pollinate the almond groves. Each of those colonies, at a minimum, would have 30,000 bees. So that's 51 billion bees in California to pollinate a $20 billion crop. How are you going to do that with a bunch of robots? I mean, even like I said, if you can build 100 robots for $1, you're talking about $500 million worth of robot bees to pollinate that crop, which is more than what they're currently paying. The current rate is around $200 per hive. So at $1.7 million times $200, all those almond grove orchard owners pay around $340 million a year to pollinate their crop. But it's a $2 billion crop. So it's still a pretty cost-effective way to do it. But spending $500 million to have a robot do it? And that's, you know, and I don't think you could build a robot bee for a penny. under the best conditions. So, so that's my take on robotic bees. I think if we want to spend the money, let's spend the money on trying to figure out how to keep the bees we have alive, instead of trying to come up with some other way of doing it. So I'll take any other questions that people have.
How territorial are they? I mean, could you bring in another hive if there's one that's like
Oh,
a natural
people
one?
in general, when they place colonies together, they're placed about this far apart. Not, I mean, they don't put them right next to each other, but usually a half a foot to 2 foot apart.
So they play well together.
Oh yeah. Well, they can, if colonies become really weak, you can have what's called robbing, where they'll go in and try to steal the honey from another colony. But that's, again, that's just a sign that that whatever colony is getting robbed is extremely weak. And you can do things like put that entrance reducer on, or even if you don't want to do an entrance reducer, the other thing that people are building now is, it'll be a little difficult to show unless I put this together. But basically, when the hive is completely open, like this, there'd be this whole entrance in the front. The difference between a regular foraging bee that's from this colony and a robber bee is a foraging bee will come up here, she'll land and crawl in. A robber bee will come, fly straight in. So what you can do is you can put a cover like this to force them to land and crawl up. And that will pretty effectively stop robbing just that, because those robber bees have to be able to get in past the bees that guard the front. And the only way they can do that is if they can fly straight in. Yeah.
So, Varroa mites, do you ever use the sticky paper underneath the screen board?
You can do that. That's mostly, I think people mostly use that though just to count, as a way to count. Yeah, that's also why people use these screen bottom boards. So the thing about the mite is, that's another genetic behavior that they're trying to breed into honeybees, is what's called grooming behavior, because just in the process of bees grooming each other, they'll sometimes knock the mites off. I mean, if I was a honeybee and I had a mite on me, it would be like this big. You'd be able to see it very easily. You know, it'd look like a compact. It'd be about the size of a compact disc or so. And so while they're grooming each other, they sometimes knock the mites off. And the mites, they have legs, but they really can't crawl around. So if they get knocked off, they'll fall through the screen and they'll just die. If you have a solid bottom board, the mite might be able to reattach itself to a bee as it's coming through. That's the whole theory behind this. It's not a way to prevent mites. It's a way to maybe eliminate 20% of them. I mean, it's one of those every little bit helps. And it also, this is also beneficial for ventilation too. So it's a dual purpose thing to have a screen bottom board. And then you'd put that sticky paper under there to count. And sometimes people do that too if they're treating for mites and they want to see a bunch of dead mites on the sticky paper. They'll use that.
I have another question.
Sure.
So for the winter, you stick them in the over, usually in 2 or 3 of the larger boxes.
Mm-hmm.
Will you actually stick the hives close together then? Like back to back or side to side?
I usually just leave them where they've been all summer. I just have mine here in town. So where I'm at, I actually have there's a little 4-foot fence that's on the north and west of the property, and then there's a garage there. So there's already a nice windbreak there, and they're facing to the south, and they're really well protected from the wind. Plus, they're right there where I could go see them and work them easily. So even in the wintertime, if I need to go out there and shovel. That's the other thing that I do in the wintertime sometimes too, because I usually just put these on top of a pallet. And if you get enough snow and it blows, you'll actually get some snow blocking the entrance, and I'll have to brush the snow away. That's the only other thing.
Do you try to refrain from opening your hive in the winter?
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't go into them at all until it's at least 50, 60 degrees outside. Or unless I know that they're dead, and then I'll just,
I had a drone come after me. Is there a different, maybe it was a fluke thing, but like a drone kind of came after me and was pestering me, my son and I one day when we went to go look at the bees. And I was wondering if that was just do you see a temperament difference between the drones and the worker bees?
well, the drones shouldn't, I mean, if they bother you at all, there's nothing they can do because they can't sting you.
Okay.
But I don't know. I mean, typically what bees do, it's kind of weird. They must have much more intelligence than you think, because bees must know that they're going to die if they sting you, because they don't just come out and sting you. Typically what happens with me, if I'm working a colony of bees and they start to get a little mad, the first thing they'll do is they'll buzz around your head, and then they'll fly straight at your face and bounce off of you. That's their warning shot. They'll almost always do that before they'll just come and sting you. I have had it happen before where I just get stung out of the blue, but that doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, they're flying around your head, flying around your face, trying to get you to go away. Because they, like I said, I think that they know they're going to die when they sting you. They're willing to do that if that's what it comes to, but they're not just going to sting you and die because you might be a threat. So that's always been my experience with European honeybees. I've not dealt with Africanized ones. You will have colonies, though, that usually due to some sort of environmental condition where they will get more defensive. That can happen especially in the fall. Skunks are really bad around here for making hives mean, because skunks don't seem to be bothered by bee stings, and so they'll come up, they'll scratch at the hive, the bees will come, and they'll just start eating them. And that can make a very defensive hive, and so you might go out one day and this hive that was always gentle and didn't bother you will just all of a sudden be really mean. And they're like, I just opened you up and now you're all flying around trying to drive me away. That's usually why. Because some environmental thing has caused them to do that.
Yeah, it was the first time I seen drones outside of my hive. And so what you're describing sounds about right. It was coming at her face and it was kind of like following us, so we backed away from the hive.
Yeah, like I said, that's usually what they're doing, is they're just trying to get you to back away. And any other questions?
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.